Welcome. I'm John McLean, and I'll be your moderator for this morning's webinar, CFO Perspective of Energy Efficiency and On-Site Renewables. PGE seminars, webinars, and online courses are sponsored by the Energy Trust of Oregon and the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. PGE works closely with these organizations to provide incentives and free services to help utility customers to use energy wisely. Today's topic was developed because of feedback from utility customers who have attended PGE seminars in the past, especially the operations managers, engineers, and staff professionals. They said they often found good projects, but couldn't get the budget approved to do them. One facilities manager, a young dad who I think often read fairy tale stories to his children, said that talking to the CFO was like trying to talk and reason with a grumpy ogre that lives under the bridge and who spoke in some foreign language known only to his minions of finance and accounting staff. Now, I must confess, I was one of those minions years ago, manager of planning and budgeting, and I did report to the CFO. So I reached out to some of the experts, as well as engineers, to develop a half-day seminar to help operations managers and staff to better understand the perspectives of the CFO. Today's webinar will cover a couple of highlights from that event: CFO methods of evaluating individual projects, and CFO methods of ranking all projects to determine which ones can get funding. But first, let's try using some of those tools again. Here are three of some of the most common terms or reasons that I've heard from customers about why they want PGE to focus on the language of CFOs. Please use the tools at the upper left-hand corner to mark one of these three boxes on the screen. Here are some examples that I've heard from customers in the past. I'm on the operations side of the organization, and I want a basic overview of budgeting and financial terms needed to get energy efficiency projects approved for funding from the budget and finance side of the organization. Another said, I have a business background, but I need a refresher of the terms and concepts specifically as they apply to energy efficiency. Another was a consultant who was curious about why PGE is telling what PGE is telling its customers and how to quantify the benefits of energy efficiency projects. And finally, a sales representative said, I don't know how to help my customers quantify the benefits of buying our equipment in terms that their CFOs use to evaluate projects. So whether you're a novice, an expert, or getting a refresher, or a curious consultant, I hope you find this webinar helpful to get approval for energy savings projects that change the behavior, the processes, and the equipment systems at your organization. Now, from the chart, I see that there are a lot of you that are energy efficiency focused, and you want to do a better job of getting projects approved. Some of you are already experts, so you can keep me straight today, and you're looking for a refresher. And there are a couple of people who are curious. All of those are great reasons to be here today. So today we will cover three areas very briefly. There's a long list of terms, methods, and acronyms that compose the language utilized by financial and budgeting staff. We will cover just a few of the more common ones. We will apply these common methods of project evaluation to a few simple examples to show you how they're used. Lastly, we will review a few processes that are used to select which projects get funded now and which will have to wait until a later date. First, let me show you a survey as I did research for this webinar. The survey was done to financial CFOs around the country in a lot of different industries. And as you can see, the top four here are IRR, NPV, hurdle rate, payback, and the one we'll also discuss today is discounted payback. We won't talk about all these. The point of this chart is check out your organization, find out what kinds of terms or methods are used for project evaluation. And different companies with different CFOs might use different methods. So it's something that you need to stay aware of and stay on top of if you want to maximize the chances of project approval. Many of you have already had some experience using the simple payback period. It's a universal method for evaluating an energy savings project or making a purchase decision. It is easily understood by homeowners as well as business professionals. Incentive programs often use this method to determine the eligibility for an incentive. Many organizations find this method to be adequate for determining funding of projects, but many other organizations, especially large ones, often have more project requests that can be funded each year, or they have very large projects that take years to build and last several decades. In these cases, it is likely that more sophisticated methods are used to evaluate and rank projects. For example, two projects with the same payback period may seem alike in the short term, but look very different using the more sophisticated measures common to the CFO and their staff. The next slides will explain the most common of these financial measures utilized by management. Let's start with a review of the basic math of measuring energy savings, specifically electricity, although similar charts could be made for measuring therms, water, and other natural resources. Typically, 90% of the electric bill is a result of energy usage, or the acronym kWh. The price of a kWh is often referred to as the electricity rate and may change from year to year or be adjusted even month to month. But the other factor that makes bills go up and down are from hour to hour is the energy use, or kWh. Demand charges are also a small part of the bill and are a measure of the highest average kWh use in a half-hour period during the billing cycle. The term is printed on the bill as rate per kW, and one of the line items along with many other line items that show rate per kWh. In summary, the two most common terms for the price of electricity are kWh and kW, the demand. The energy engineers here at PGE remind me that when you focus on reducing kWh use, it is likely that kW demand will also be reduced. So for the purposes of today's webinar, we will only focus on kWh. Now, electric bills are in units of kWh. Let's break this acronym apart into three pieces. The K is kilo. You might read the local newspaper and see MWH for megawatts or 1,000,000 watts, especially when the topic is large power plants. W stands for watts, the basic unit of power. It is often found on the nameplate of the equipment or on the packaging. H, of course, is the hours of use, and I have found this is the least understood part of a business, their hours of operation of a particular piece of equipment. Taxes we won't cover today because they vary widely from customer to customer and year to year, so taxes aren't included in this presentation. Some customers don't pay any taxes, schools, governments, churches, nonprofits, and others pay taxes in good years, but nothing in bad years. So in the first case, let's look at an example. We have a large room, 40 fixtures, and we have the decision in front of us that the existing fixtures I could replace with 130 watts, or I could replace them with a more expensive 74 watts. So if I do this project, I could save the 130 watts minus the 74 times 40 fixtures. I could save 2,240 watts per year, per hour for doing this project. Next, let's find the K. That's easy. Divide the 2,240 watts by the 1,000 per kilo, and I will get 2.24 kW is the demand that these lights place on the system. But the next is making an estimate of how long the lights are on. Let's assume that you know for a fact they are on 10 hours a day, and they're on every day of the year, so that's 3,650 hours a year that the lights are on. Now we can do our math. We can calculate the kWh, 2.24 kW times 3,650 hours, 8,176 kWh per year. If we look at kind of an average price for a mid-level commercial business, we might see that that's a little over 8 cents. I can now multiply that times the kilowatt hours I've saved and determine that I've saved $658.17 a year, assuming that electric rate and assuming those hours of use. Now that we've calculated the energy savings for our project, we can calculate the simple payback. If I take my 40 fixtures and look at their cost, minus the incentives you might find from the Energy Trust or tax credits or accelerated depreciation or other benefits, I have a net cost of $2,000. If I take that $2,000, the first question might be asked is, when do I get my money back if I give you $2,000? And of course, you can say, I'm going to give you back $658 a year, so it's going to take a little over 3 years to get your $2,000 back. This is the simple payback period. But simple payback doesn't take into consideration the time value of money, or the future might have uneven costs and benefits. So often, rather than simple payback, they will use cash flow payback. They'll make some assumption about electric rates in the future. In this case, we would assume some inflation rate. So the $658 of savings would become $684 in the second year, $712 in the third year, and so on for the term of your project. In this case, we've looked at 5 years for the project. If each year then we subtract the savings from the investment, we see that you get your money back somewhere in the third year. In fact, somewhere in the second year. So 2.92 is the cash flow payback, a little different than the simple payback. And this is very useful for uneven costs and benefits in future years. Now let's look at one of the most let's look at a sophisticated way, and that's called discounted cash flow, DCF, the time value of money. If you hear these terms in discussions about budgets and projects, the two most common examples or methods are going to be NPV, or the net present value. It's the result of looking at those future cash in and cash out flows in out years and recognizing that $100 5 years from now is not worth $100 today. This example is if I ask you, gee, loan me $100 and I'm going to pay you $100 5 years from now, you would say, wait a minute, that's not necessarily a good deal. There is a value of money that is recognized over time. The reciprocal of that, or related to that, is the internal rate of return. You may hear IRR, the internal rate of return, the rate at which the discount on all cash flows to a net present value of 0. And I will show you specifically what that means. But net present value and IRR are probably the two most common ways to recognize or discount cash flows in the future to make them present day. So let's do a little survey and use those tools out there. I've got my pointer, but you can pick any other tool you want. And identify the general term or method that your organization used for evaluating projects. So place the arrows or marks in the various boxes. Some organizations may use simple payback as its initial screening, but for ranking and other purposes, it will use the more sophisticated terms. Sometimes the payback rule for a business depends on the perspective. In our business, 5 years or less payback, and we use the cash flow payback method, gets you to fill out the paperwork. But NPV, net present value, is used for making the long-term decisions. For governmental entities, they've heard 10-year payback periods, but for other companies, it might be 2 years. Probably the most common I've heard is a 3-year payback rule to get started. So I see we have a good representation of knowledge in the room. We have net present value, IRR, is being used by a few companies, and several say, I don't know. I love the artist that we see here with the frowny face. And I guess my advice is, for those that don't know, I highly recommend you find someone in the budget department, take them out for coffee or lunch, and start a conversation, ask for some guidance. The more you know about the organization's evaluation methods, the more likely you can get approval of your projects. So let's look at another example. Example 1, replacing the 40 fixtures, but let's look at it through these the new lens that we've learned. And I'm going to take that $2,000. And here's my savings I calculated before, and I've assumed some rate of inflation. And I put a new term in there called salvage. Quite often, when you're looking in the long term, over the life of the project, at the end of the life, the equipment may have some salvage value, so make sure you include that. Now, when you look at your cash flows from a CFO point of view, you see that they see $2,000 going out of pocket initially and then in future years, I get money coming back in the door from the savings and from the salvage value. So if I net all those costs, minus $2,000 plus all those other numbers, I will get a net $1,615 net value. So you might say, gee, that looks like a pretty good project. But when applying the time value, suddenly these future values, the $658 here, only becomes $598 when I've discounted it at 10%. That 10% can represent the cost of borrowing the money and giving it to you. So there is a cost of money, the cost of time, the time value of money. So in this case, the $658 a year from now only became $598 in benefit, and so on out to the fifth year, where $770 became $478 in today's present value. Now when I net all these costs, I end up with a net present value of $714, not the $1,615 without the time value. That's assuming my cost of capital and my money was 10%. If you run the IRR calculation, and in Excel nowadays, both NPV and IRR are easy to do, it will tell you it's a 22.65% internal rate of return. Another way of looking at it is, if your cost of money was 22.65%, then the cash flows you show in your project would net 0 in present value. So as long as you can borrow money less than 22.65%, you will have a positive net present value for this kind of project. Now let's look at a different example, replacing a smaller project, 15 fixtures. And now I have a net cost out of pocket of $1,260. That's the gross minus incentives to be a net. Here are my savings calculations over time, assuming inflation, and again, I have salvage value. So my cash flows look like $1,260 out of pocket now, and I get $302 back a year from now, $308, et cetera. So the net value of this project, you might think, looks positive. It has a positive net value of $363. But if I discount this for time value, the $302 up here becomes $275 and so on. So now my net value is only $41 negative. It never pays back my $1,260 over this 5-year period. It in fact costs me money. Another way to look at this is the IRR of 8.76% is the return of this project, but it cost me 10% to borrow the money. So any time that your IRR is higher than your cost of money, you're going to find the CFO say, this is not a good deal. Obviously, if you were buying stock and you said, I'm borrowing money at 10% to buy stock that returns me 8.76% return over the years, you wouldn't make that deal. So the CFO is pretty smart in this case to apply discounting for time value on this project. So let's use this chart again. I want to move on to applying logic on equipment that is in a facility you own versus equipment in facilities that you lease, or do you have a mix of owned and leased? The reason this becomes important part of today is I spoke to the facilities manager of a major hospital system with 4 or 5 hospitals and clinics spread out through the communities in Oregon and Washington. And he was very pleased that he had completed, in his terms, all of the projects, the lighting projects, had been completed over a 5-year period, and that he was done doing that. And I asked him the question, are all your facilities, do you own them? And they said, well, no. A lot of the clinics are out in leased spaces in business complexes. And I said, well, what about those projects? And I said, oh, well, we never look at energy efficiency in leased spaces. And I said, well, then you really haven't accomplished all the energy efficiency you can. And he happened to be at the bottom box down here, that he had a mix of own and lease, but wasn't thinking about lease space. Well, good. I see we do have some people with mixed, and we have some people in leased spaces. So let's take a look at another way to approach analyzing projects. And I call this the annualizing the cost per kilowatt hour. This has other terms, but we'll deal with annualizing because we all know and think about mortgages or car loans, and we know that once we have the amount we want to borrow and an interest rate, we can kind of calculate what is going to be our monthly or our annual cost of ownership through mortgage or loan payments. So in this case, we're going to take our 15 fixture project and we're going to apply it. 20 years, if I own the building, the lights will last about 20 years. My cost of money in this case is 7.59. I picked that because that might be a very typical cost of capital for a utility business. The project costs here were $1,260 from our previous example. And if we ask it for what the annual payment is, not the monthly, but the annual, it's going to tell us it's costing you $124 a year to fund this project. Now, we know it was 4,380 kilowatt hours savings. So if you divide the $124 by the kilowatt hours, it's the equivalent of buying power at 2.8 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, that might be a pretty good deal because if you don't do this project, you will keep paying 8 cents a kilowatt hour for that 4,380 kilowatt hours every year, or $352. So now what you really have is the choice of doing nothing, which is to pay the $352, or the choice of doing something, which is to pay only the $124. This is quite often a good perspective, and this project obviously looks pretty good. Now let's say we have the identical project, 15 fixtures, in a lease space for which you have a 5-year lease. Again, the simple payment calculation can tell you I want to borrow money for 5 years. Let's say it's 10%. Let's use the $1,260 again, and it's going to be $332 a year in payment, which is the equivalent of buying power at 7.6 cents. That's still better than buying the power at 8 cents. So even in lease spaces, my advice is run the numbers. If you commonly are in lease spaces for 5 years with a renewal of another 5 years, maybe you want to use 10 years, run the numbers and you may find that there are savings for you, very good savings in lease spaces. Annualized cost is also called levelized cost in some industries. So don't be confused by annualized versus levelized. They're talking about the payment function. Interest rate may also be called cost of capital. It could be called a hurdle rate. So those terms are synonyms for the purposes of my examples here. So now that we've calculated the cost of doing something and the cost of doing nothing, it may have some influence with the budget department or a CFO that what is the cost of not doing a project is a pretty common question. Well, if I don't do this project, what happens? Well, now you can calculate and say if you don't do this project, you're costing yourself $228 a year. The $352 you're paying now, the $124 you would pay if you do the project, there's your $228 cost of delaying this project every year. What's interesting is every year you delay it, not the interest rate, but the electricity rate might go up with inflation. So each year that cost of waiting could go up. So let's move on to the most common non-energy benefit of energy efficiency, especially been in the news lately about carbon legislation from Washington. Climate change, those kinds of terms, they all have a focus on CO2 and things like the CO2 footprint. The average in the Western grid, if you go to the Energy Information Administration.gov, is about 0.95 pounds per kilowatt hours for the particular year that I looked at, or about 1 pound per kilowatt hour. Each utility has a different mix of power plants, wind, hydro, gas, coal, and so they are likely to have different conversion rates from CO2 to kilowatt hours. Some are higher and some are lower than this average. The key point here is saving electricity also saves CO2, and that might be a benefit important to your organization. So I want you to use your tools again, excuse me, and help me understand, does your company Does your company have what's called a green team? It might be called a sustainability committee. And whether or not they have a carbon goal. And it may be that you really don't know. Okay, it looks like, again, we have a representation of all those. I would highly recommend that if you have one, a green team, go find it, start up a conversation. They might be a big supporter of energy efficiency projects. And as a nice energy champions approach, we have some seminars on energy champions, concepts, how to get them started in your company, how to develop plans. Been very effective in many companies. Other companies may have a target of, we need to reduce our carbon footprint. That's important to us and it's important to their customers. If you don't know, again, start up a conversation, see who you can find that might be interested in starting such a part in your organization. Another reason I think that's important is, as we've seen over the last 7 years that we've been working on these kinds of seminars, the titles of people are changing. It used to be that you would see facilities manager, and then suddenly facilities and sustainability manager, they're combining it. Or they may just be sustainability manager alone. But the titles of people and professionals we see attending our seminars are beginning to clearly reflect the sustainability and climate change issues for organizations, whether you're a profit or a nonprofit. It doesn't seem to make any difference. So let's look at applying our methods we've learned. We had a CFO panel of a recent seminar, and they said, keep it simple, keep it to one page. They are very busy people, so I'm giving you kind of a template here of how you would have all the information needed to have the major influence that you can on getting your projects approved. So we have our gross incentives and net costs. Don't forget to point out that there are incentives to help pay for the project. We can do our calculation of savings. In this case, here's our $2,818 savings per year. Assuming price increases, we have 35,000 kilowatt hours saved in about 8 cents. Our payback period then is 3.4 years. If we run our spreadsheet on this cash flow, we will find that the internal rate of return was 31.2%. So as long as the CFO can borrow money and has money available that's less than 31%, this will have a positive net present value on this project. If that doesn't work, or if they need additional discussion, we can do the annualizing calculation. So we go to our payment function on our calculator or spreadsheet. We plug in 7.59% interest rate if we know that that's the cost of capital for that company. We have a 20-year life. We know that it costs us a net $10,000. It will tell you $988 is my annual cost for this project. If you divide that by the 35,000 kilowatt hours, this project is no different than a purchase power contract in the purchasing department buying power at 2.8 cents instead of buying power at 8 cents. So that might be another way to look at this project, is as if it was buying power, not saving power. Finally, we can use our math we've learned today to calculate the cost of doing something, the cost of doing nothing, and saying every year that you delay this project, there is a cost of waiting. And of course, at the bottom here, I've picked an arbitrary estimate of 1.29 pounds per kilowatt hour and said over the 20 years of this project, there are 903,000 pounds of CO2 that you can claim that you've reduced your footprint. So that might have another influence on getting your project approved versus other projects that might have the same financial returns but don't have this extra benefit. So all on one page here, you can see we've got a lot of information that might be useful to influence CFOs and budget managers to getting project approval. Now let's say that you're in a leased space and they are asking, well, why should I do this in a leased space? Again, we've run the numbers here. In this case, I've said this is a 5-year life or the 5-year term of the lease. Run the numbers, and of course, this is another great example where the payback period is still 3.4 years. It hasn't changed. But the internal rate of return now is 14%. That's much lower than if it was in a 20-year building. So the long term doesn't look as good as the other, even though the short-term payback period is identical. We can do our annualization approach, take our $10,000, cost of capital over 5 years, divide the payment by the $35,000, and you are buying power at 7.1 cents for a 5-year term. That's still better than the paying the 8 cents, and there is a cost of waiting. With only 5 years on this particular project, you save less pounds per kilowatt hour. Not per kilowatt, you save less pounds over the term, but it's still a substantial reduction in the footprint. So run the numbers, leased or owned space, and see if the project doesn't pencil out. So the conclusions for the math portion of today are beyond simple payback, there are additional calculations and costs and non-energy benefits that provide useful information that can affect customers' decision-making processes regarding energy efficiency projects. NPV and IRR, they focus on the future cash flows and risks and provide a long-term view. The annualization approach can be compared to current retail rates, and now you have a power purchase perspective rather than a capital project perspective. The cost of waiting is also a eye-opening number quite often to budget staff. And finally, get the company focused on carbon footprint. It is a future issue that all corporations are going to have to deal with at some point. So with that, if you have some questions regarding the math or the numbers, use the chat, send a question to Lorena. And meanwhile, I want to deal with ranking criteria. So let's assume that the company has a whole lot of projects, a lot more than it can possibly fund. It has to have a way to rank them, to sort them from high to low, and make a decision on who gets funding and who doesn't. Now, some business customers might have a focus on the carbon footprint and might look at your projects in a good eye, so make sure you include that. Other customers have long-term perspectives. And if they think in the long term, there are probably going to be a lot more choices they have of what a good project looks like. Business customers who own and occupy their own buildings will have the most choices than the businesses who only operate in a lease space, but you still want to run the numbers to find out about lease space. And finally, if you're a customer, like the example I gave of the healthcare industry, you might have multiple buildings and locations. You're going to have a lot more choices and challenge in getting funding than if you just have a single building. So what do we mean by ranking? Well, let's assume your business only uses the payback, in this case, the cash flow payback rule. And they have projects all over California, northern, southern, central. They've got compressed air, they've got motors, they've got photovoltaics on the roof, ground source heat pump is GSHPs, solar thermal for replacing electric hot water with solar heating hot water, and maybe HVAC in one of an office building. So you sort all these by payback period. If the company has a 3-year payback rule, again, that's the most common rule, you might only do one project that seriously gets considered for funding. But what if we sorted it by some of these other numbers? Let's take a look at the annual cost of waiting. If I resort my list by the annual cost of waiting, I suddenly get a different perspective. Wow, that's a lot of money that you're not getting every year by postponing or delaying. So in this case, it may be that everything above $5,000 in cost of waiting, I might want to seriously consider for doing as a project. And if we sort it by net present value, again, you're going to get a different look than just payback period. In this case, the heat pump system for the office building might be the number one value from a net present value point of view, and several other projects that are above that 3-year payback rule might actually look pretty good from a net present value point of view. In an example I've given here, if you had $500,000 as a CFO, then you take this project list, you do the top 4 projects above the line I've shown. That would equal $490,000. Well, then you would have $10,000 left over. You wouldn't be able to do the next project, which requires $45,000. You'd reach down to the commercial lighting owner project and do that project because it happens to cost $10,000. Finally, the carbon footprint. I like doing it this way to give a new perspective of projects. That is a lot of pounds of carbon, and the project list, again, looks different than using payback or NPV or the cost of waiting. In this case, if the company has a major objective, a goal for reducing their footprint, they may say, you know, we should probably go out and find the funding for every project that saves more than £1 million over the life of the project. That might be a really good rule of thumb to use, and in this case, you'd have more projects than any of the other ranking processes. So ranking, sorting, all those, I think, add perspective and impetus to getting projects done. So use your tools again and give me some feedback on whether or not you know that your organization does have a ranking, does not have a ranking, or you don't know.
And John, while participants are circling or putting an X, can you share how PGE does their ranking?
Sure. Our long-term ranking is done by net present value. The CFO and all the previous CFOs since my many years here, long-term thinking is net present value. We don't use internal rate of return. We use the NPV approach. However, we also use as the first criteria the cash flow payback as, do you even want to fill out the paperwork? Well, if it's not 5 years or less, then you really don't have a project that's going to be seriously considered. So it's a two-step process. So it looks like some of you know, and quite a few you don't know, and you know what I'm going to say is find that person in the budget department or the finance department, or maybe even the CFO, and say, hey, let's meet. I'll buy the coffee, and see if you can get some feedback and some information on how the company is making its decisions. And maybe you get to influence them as well on some of the ranking things we've talked about today. So ranking, my conclusions of what I've learned: evaluating the non-energy benefits of CO2 savings for energy efficiency projects definitely adds new perspective to many of our customer organizations and adds value to your project. Calculating the annual cost per kilowatt hour of an efficiency project definitely opens up some eyes and a different way of looking at a project as a purchasing of electricity. And if you don't do the project, the cost of waiting. Both of those add value to the project and getting approval. And finally, if you look at ranking the projects by multiple factors, not just simple payback, you might be able to encourage approval of more energy efficiency renewable projects than any one method alone. So those are my lessons learned over the years from my customers and being in the finance and accounting area. So in summary, I would say that the simple payback method is a common rule of thumb. It's definitely a good one to use to get an idea whether the project is something in the early stages might have the possibility of further measuring and evaluation. But if you really want to maximize your chances of getting final approval, it's a pretty good idea to use some of the terms we've explained today around net present value, internal rate of return, annualizing. Have all that information available, and I think you're going to find that your project might have more credibility in getting funding than some who haven't gone to that kind of effort. And I guess the last one I'd leave you with today is something that I got feedback from people who attended our seminars is they never really understood that no doesn't mean never when you're talking to a CFO. Quite often, no means not now. It means I don't have the money this year, but keep coming back. And on the operating side of most businesses that have facilities, engineers, people that no means no. I mean, if you ask for approval by the third time, you're not going to even submit that project anymore. If you've said no means no. And the reality is it doesn't mean no. I would never take no for an answer in an energy efficiency project. The incentives could change. They could go up. The cost of the project might go down. The cost of electricity might change. The cost of therms for gas may change. There's a lot of things that change from year to year. If I had an intern on staff, or I hire summer interns, I would have them every year go check and rerun the numbers. It may be that this is the year that your project gets funded. So keep your list of projects alive, check the numbers, and never take no for an answer. Assume no means not now. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it back to Lorena to see what kinds of questions we have.
Thank you, John. And this slide here shows that we do also offer free energy consultations. If you want to contact Paula or Darren, they can do a phone or on-site consultation for you. And we do have some questions that came through that we're going to be going over, but if you have any others, feel free to chat them, or if you want to ask or share some of your examples over the phone, let me know. So John, the first question that came up is, what is the difference between ROI and payback period?
That's a good question. ROI is used by some organizations, and a lot of vendors and sales personnel use ROI. If you divide the investment, remember that net project cost, by the savings, you get the number of years in the payback. But if I look at the investment as the denominator and divide that into my savings, I get a return on investment. So ROI is simply the reciprocal of the payback period. It is used sparingly. I've never seen it make the top 10 list, but ROI is directly connected to simple payback.
Thanks, John. The next question is, people are asking if it's possible to get a copy of your Excel worksheet where you had the examples, and is that easy for them to enter their data and be able to calculate it?
I would be happy to share that spreadsheet with those examples in it. I think you'd have to modify it to fit your organization. There are people here at PGE that would be glad to help with that, or the Energy Trust. So yes, if you'd like, make sure that Lorena gets you a copy with the, you do a PDF of the handouts, I believe, as well. So we'll send that spreadsheet out and see if it can help you.
And some people mentioned they've heard the term MIRR. How is that related to IRR?
That's another good one. Someone who obviously has either a sophisticated organization or a little bit of background. IRR is internal rate of return. MIRR is modified internal rate of return. And once computers in Excel became more and more sophisticated, you will find that in Excel there is a function for IRR and there is a function for MIRR. Simply put, the modified internal rate of return is a more conservative way to look at a project. For example, if you had a project that says it returns 33%, it's obviously generating excess cash flows. And IRR assumes that those cash flows continue to earn at the 33% all the way through the life of the project. The reality is any excess funds thrown off by a project would be reinvested at a more normal interest rate, say 10%, for any excess funds. So you literally have to feed the function to interest rates. So think of it as a more conservative way of looking at IRR. It's a growing in popularity, but I haven't seen a whole lot of companies that are using it yet.
Thanks, John. Several times you mentioned you had the seminar, and some of the people joining today were not able to attend that. Can you do just a brief, who were the CFO speakers, and what were some of the advisor tidbits that they shared?
Sure. We had our own Chief Financial Officer of Portland General Electric. And he did, I think, a really good job of helping operating staff understand that they really do want good projects, but they don't need all the details that quite often engineers or operations folks want to go into. The CFO wants to keep it really simple, and that's why I've shown you slides today that kind of capsulize everything. So if you walk in and think that you have to explain a 20-page justification for a project, the CFO said quite often that's not what the best thing to do is. Keep it simple, but do your homework as if there were 20 pages, but don't make the CFO read through 20 pages to get the answer. The other financial director we had was from Sherry's restaurant chain. So here's a national, well, Western chain. And that was a really interesting speech because the champion of energy efficiency came from the financial side of the organization, not the operations side. And I think it shows the power of making a friend, a teammate, between the operations and the financial side. They have driven a huge amount of savings at the various restaurants, not just electricity, but natural gas, water, all the resources that make up their utility bills. And again, I think they also agreed that it required two things, keeping it simple, and they also said it was really important to have that bridge between the operating staff and the financial staff. So those were the takeaways that I would say are the most interesting.
Great, thank you, John. And that was the last question, so thank you everybody for that and for joining us today.